The sermon title today on this Easter Sunday, Eating Alone. Eating Alone. I read that Andy Warhol in 1975 in his book, The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, wrote that I like eating alone when I want to open a chain of restaurants called the Andy Mats, where you will come in and you get your food and you'll go to a booth with seating for one, and you'll sit and eat alone while watching TV. I also read that the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard said the saddest thing, sadder than destitution and sadder than a beggar, is the man who eats alone. He said even animals indicates to us that food is to be shared. They share it, or at least they threaten each other around the food. In his book, Bowling Alone, which prompted my title, Eating Alone, Putnam, that sociologist, addressed what he thought the diminishing social capital of U.S. society, saying that the American population is less and less invested in democracy in the end. Social actions and membership, he said, of every organization that people used to belong to, all of that, those numbers are diminishing. And the church can probably also be included in that. And Putnam said the main reason for this was the individualization to the absolute that's taking place, and he blamed the digital media for most of it. He said that enables people to feel connected and to have the experience of community without having direct contact face-to-face with anybody. That you can live a solitary life while experiencing or thinking you are experiencing community. Baudrillard, that philosopher that I said that I mentioned, that said eating alone is a very sad thing. He said that with digital media and the digital age, we are developing hyper-reality. And he said hyper-reality is the condition when the consciousness is no longer able to distinguish between what is reality and what is a simulation of reality. What is pretending to be reality and giving you a perspective or something that purports to be reality. I think reality TV is an excellent example of that. It is so real that you are unable to distinguish between what is really real and what happens on reality TV. And Baudrillard uses the example of Disneyland. He says, for instance, the Venice that you will find in Disneyland is better than the real Venice. It is such a good simulation that you say, right, that is Venice. And it's less expensive, I think, to get there. Or it used to be, I don't know anymore. I think they have perfected the art of robbing you of everything, including your self-respect, when you enter through the gates of the kingdom of Disney. What does that have to do with Easter? If we look at the few verses we listened to in the Gospel according to John, we find a description that was created probably 2 decades after those events. And it speaks of disciples being gathered, followers of Jesus being gathered in a locked facility. a room somewhere, probably trying to figure out what is going on. Jesus gone, crucified, and in the grave. And some news of, that he rose from the grave, that he has been seen. And I'm hesitant to do that, but probably an example of fake news that they experienced. Wondering what is going on. These comments on Jesus being in the grave and now that he's alive, and then a strange reality that Jesus was with them. Trying to figure out what is going on. What is real? And before we venture into what is commonly experienced or practiced as an Easter practice or a custom, is having the debate whether it was really a bodily resurrection or not, or whether it's all metaphorical. And in the process, I think we missed the point asking what is the message, whether we see it as a physical bodily resurrection or whether we see it as all metaphorical. I think the reality dawning on the disciples and the ones following them, the early church, was that there was a price to be paid for considering belonging to that community. And it was experienced and expressed in the meal practice, which was at the heart of the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. And it was also at the heart of the message and the ministry of the Apostle Paul, who really closely emulated Jesus in his practices. If we take Paul, for instance, Paul would structure the meal in the early Christian church totally different from what was the practice in the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, it was customary and it was appropriate. That was the custom. That is how any civilized person would do it, was to have specific seating arrangements, to have specific food being served, and to being served in a very specific way, all dependent on what your status was in society. There was one place for the important people, and then as you go down the pecking order, people would be seated accordingly, and the good stuff, the good food and the good drink would be served to those people in the important seats. And the stuff that was below grade, the ones seated in the least important seats would get that. And Paul says, if you read in the Corinthians, be careful how you eat. Be careful how you participate in this communion, this communal meal. And he says, well, some of you come early, and by the time the last ones arrive, some of you are already drunk. You've drunk too much. And he says, and some of you bring nice stuff to eat, and by the time that the people who really need that stuff, who are dependent on getting something from this communal meal, by the time they arrive, you have eaten the food that they were supposed to survive on. Because that was one of the purposes of the communal meals, is to take care of the poor. But that wasn't really what Paul was talking about. That's important stuff, yes. But what he was really talking about was the potential price for participating in that meal, because it was also a protest action, a slap in the face of the Roman Empire. That said, we do not accept the way that you are organizing things and that you are structuring society. The way of the empire is not our way. the way of God's love and the community based and gathered in God's love. That is different. There is a different way of doing things. Very similar to what Jesus did when he walked the earth. It was the same society, and not only did Jesus criticize the Roman Empire in their practices, he also criticized the Jewish establishment with all their rules about purity. This one cannot eat with that one unless you go through the whole process of going to the temple, making your sacrifice, and then being declared holy by the priest again. This one cannot eat with that one because they belong to a different group. This one is not such a good believer, therefore we cannot share food. Because I think Baudrillard was correct in saying that in food there is this need almost that comes to the surface of it to be shared. I sometimes eat alone, also as an act of defiance, or, as a rebel, because I have to so often say grace when I eat with other people that I try to shy away from that. Because it's always, will you say grace, the minister? But I also, in my personal experience, that food is to be shared. And we shared a meal this morning. And I wonder if we today acknowledge the risk of sharing this meal. We do not share the same risk as the early Christians of being arrested by the Romans for the insult of disrespecting the way of the empire. We do not share that risk, but there is a responsibility and a privilege associated with this meal in the practice of Jesus and also in the practice of the Apostle Paul. That when we partake of this meal, we give expression to that central truth and that value that is non-negotiable. That we do this as an experience and an expression of God's love. That in this meal, when we partake of it, we say, we accept that God's love is one of unconditional acceptance and of equality. Everybody is treated the same. And that we embrace, and that we celebrate. But there is also a huge responsibility and a risk going with that. Not only can we celebrate that and move into a community and experience the community of unconditional acceptance and entering into a safe place where we know we will be respected, where will we not be treated differently according to our status in society or whatever other important thing yardstick we can think of, but that we will be accepted without condition. It brings the responsibility that we also have to practice that. That too, we have to subscribe to that central core value of granting that to each other, and also when we leave here, to say this is the way that we would like to see the world structured. It brings with it the responsibility to practice this covenant, this agreement, or this behavioral code towards one another in the first place, and also in the structuring of society and the world. If we are unable on Easter Sunday, when we celebrate community, to come to that reality, then Easter is in the past. It's an interesting tale or a narrative that some confused followers of somebody that was crucified unexpectedly, that they dished up. Or, even worse, we accept that narrative. So yes, we accept that it is true, but we simulate reality. It is hyper-reality for us. Because we simulate that we accept the unconditional forgiveness of God, the unconditional love, and we simulate that we subscribe to that as the yardstick and the guiding principle for our lives. But it is only pretend. It is not our reality. And therefore, on this Easter Sunday, all of us that partook of this meal, whether we regard Easter and the resurrection narrative as something that historically happened and that it is a bodily resurrection, or we say no, this is a metaphorical narrative illustrating a truth about God's love in relation to the world. Whichever side we find ourselves on and wherever we find ourselves on that spectrum, let us unite in the central message of Easter, that there is always a new beginning. That God's love is such that it brings renewal and that it brings new life. And let us open ourselves to that Easter experience, to be renewed continuously, to do things in a new way. And especially in these days that we live, let us practice part of the fruit of the Spirit and doing things differently and doing a new thing in the way that we are willing to practice tolerance and especially forgiveness, forgiving ourselves for past mistakes, forgiving each other for what we perceive as transgressions, especially in a time of a toxic political climate and divide. That we look upon each other as God's people, granting each other acceptance and the willingness to listen and to forgive and also to forget, so that we together as God's people can do a new thing in the Spirit and in the sign of Easter. May we embrace that. May we celebrate the reality of Easter and not a simulation of Easter. May God's Spirit lead us that way. And may we remember this communion as a sign of the implications and the risk of Easter. May God lead us in that way, and may we be willing followers, disciples of Jesus. Amen.